Good afternoon. For newly arrived migrants, volunteering can be a wonderful thing and a great way to settle into Australia. But understandings of volunteering can differ between cultures. So this afternoon, I'm lucky to be joined by staff from AIMS to talk about how volunteering looks in CALD communities. Before I get started though, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians where I am today, the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd encourage anyone who wants to, I know we're in different parts of the country, to acknowledge the traditional custodians where they are in the webinar chat. So just a few housekeeping notes before I introduce my two guests. Please use the chat as you like during today and use it to talk to other participants or ask questions of our two presenters. If you have a question, please raise it through that box and we'll get to it during the end. Please use that box as well to get in touch if you're having technical difficulties. And at the end of today, we'll be uploading this webinar for you to view on Volunteering Victoria's website. So without further ado, let me introduce my two guests. We have Reshma Mandhar. Reshma moved to Australia in 2002 as a migrant from Nepal. She has 10 years experience in community engagement and volunteer coordination roles. She's currently based at the AIMS Multicultural Hub in Melbourne. She's got a diploma in community development. Reshma is passionate about supporting volunteers from CALD backgrounds to make social connections and gain employment. My other presenter is Carissa Gillam. Carissa is a social researcher and policy advisor with 6 years experience in the migrant and refugee settlement sector. She's a master's in applied linguistics. In her current role at AIMS, Carissa delivers primary research and policy advice that reflects the diverse needs and experiences of multicultural communities in Victoria. Carissa has also been a volunteer English tutor with AIMS and has an interest in supporting newly arrived migrants and refugees to access the benefits of volunteering. So welcome Carissa and Reshma, and thank you both so much for joining me.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having us.
So to get us started, I thought I would ask you both to tell me a little bit about yourselves and your role. And so Reshma, can we start with you?
Yes, sure. Like you said, Sarah, I came to Australia like in 2002. And when I first came to Australia, I was given 510 hours of English, which I did with AIMS Australia. And during that time, as an English language student, I got involved in a program called AIMS Radio as a volunteer. And I made a lot of friends in that, through that volunteering program. And I realized how good it was for me becoming a volunteer, you know, getting that experience plus sort of making new friends in a new country. Then when I in my role now as a community engagement officer, where I work with a lot of volunteers, I think I sort of put myself in their shoes a lot and sort of try to encourage my volunteers in that regard. So
Fantastic.
That's me.
Fantastic, Reshma. It's so great that you can talk to the migrant volunteering experience personally, and I'm sure that's something that volunteers who you work with connect with really strongly. Carissa, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, very different to Reshma. I'm born and bred in Melbourne, lived here my whole life, and I've worked at AIMS for 6 years now, and I'm in the research and policy team. So my sort of areas of interest are migration policy, language and community development. And as you mentioned, Sarah, I actually came to AIMS as a volunteer English tutor working with newly arrived migrants and refugees who were learning English as part of the AMEP. So that's sort of how I got into the volunteering space, or where my interest really started.
Fantastic. And that's, I guess, I was just about to segue to a little bit of how did you get into this space, but that's really a bit of a good origin story that you've already covered, Carissa. Did you want to elaborate on that at all, or?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
So I've always been interested in volunteering myself, but since working at AIMS, I've really learned that volunteering benefits are twofold for many of AIM's clients who are newly arrived migrants and refugees. So yeah, I sort of learnt that when I first started volunteering myself, because I would see many of our clients that we were working with also start to volunteer, and through those opportunities they'd really learn valuable things that enhance their settlement experiences. So I don't really have a lot of volunteer management experience like Reshma, but I've been involved in research into volunteering within CALD communities for the Victorian government, and I've helped recently, within the last 12 months or so, to develop an AIMS volunteer strategy.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carissa. That's such a good kind of, one of the reasons I like to ask how people got involved in the sector is I think there's a really rich diversity in volunteering and volunteer management, and it's nice to pick up on some of those stories. So Reshma, you've told us a little bit about how you got involved with AIMS, but how did you get involved as a volunteer manager?
So like I said, like I started with AIMS as a student, then, worked as a volunteer in that project. And when my project coordinator was leaving, we were encouraged to apply for the job actually. And we did, and that's how I got my first job with AIMS, and I'm still with AIMS. That's how much I love AIMS Australia, I guess. But my involvement, it's sort of like revolving. When I started with Multicultural Hub, I was working in different projects, and then this volunteering coordinator position came up as well. And I think for me, like from a CALD background, we have volunteering in our countries as well, but sometimes we don't recognize it. We don't have a like in Australia, it's not formalized. And that sort of that interested me, and that's how I got involved with sort of volunteering with Multicultural Hub, sort of recruiting volunteers from CALD background and so on. So yeah, so that's my backstory.
Thanks, Reshma. That's great. Now, moving into, I guess, thinking about volunteering in a CALD community, when we were discussing this webinar, we thought it was really good to, I guess, deconstruct the term CALD. So I'll throw back to you, Reshma, in terms of talking about what CALD, or culturally and linguistically diverse, stands for, and I guess a little bit of commentary about that term itself.
So I think, yeah, like you said, it's CALD means culturally and linguistically diverse background. So people who, like myself, people who've come from a different culture and different countries, whose English is not a first language. So they are the CALD people. And what was the other question, Sarah? What was the second part of the question?
Oh, just a little context about, how we use the term, but perhaps you want to chime in on that, Carissa.
Yeah, well, CALD isn't really the perfect word to describe the diversity of communities.
100%.
It's not the perfect word to describe the diversity of communities across Victoria or Australia, but we continue to use it really in government and policy and research as a bit of a catch-all. And it's probably due to the fact that we don't actually have a better term or an acronym that we can all agree on that's appropriate. And I'm sure most people probably have heard, or you might not have, but before CALD we had NESB, which was non-English speaking background. So CALD is a little bit of an improvement on NESB, but it's still not a perfect term. But for lack of a better term, we keep continuing to use it, and we'll use it in this webinar for the purpose of the discussion. In terms of what I think, or how CALD describes diversity, I guess really, I think it actually can be quite a personal thing. CALD doesn't necessarily mean like you were born overseas. For example, someone born in Australia to parents born overseas, so second generation Australians, could still identify as CALD if they speak another language at home. So there's no really clear cut define of what CALD is, and it is quite a personal thing in my opinion.
Absolutely. And that's why, you know, when we were talking about this webinar and looking at volunteering within CALD communities, I guess we wanted to really deconstruct the term a little bit, but also, I guess, highlight that it's not a uniform community. It's many, many different communities from many different cultural and linguistic backgrounds.
Exactly.
Absolutely. So I'll throw back to you, Carissa, again, just to talk, you know, now that we have noted, I guess, that there is a challenge with lumping all these groups in one category, but what do we know about volunteering in CALD communities, and how does this look, and how does it fit our traditional definitions of volunteering in Australia?
Yeah, well, we've done some research into this very subject at AIMS, and we've found that a major barrier to participating in volunteering for many people from a CALD background is simply an awareness of what volunteering is or how it works in Australia. As Reshma said before, it's often not formalized in many cultures and languages. So for many people that come to Australia, volunteering is a complete foreign concept. So we can't really translate volunteering into other languages and cultures, although many people from CALD backgrounds do practice forms of what we call informal volunteering. For example, caring for an elderly person or shopping for someone who can't do it themselves. And they may not see this as volunteering like you and I might see it, but it's still volunteering. And we're learning a lot more about these forms of informal volunteering in important data collection, such as in the census, which is happening right now. And this gives us a really good picture of CALD volunteering participation, both formal and informal, as well as, you know, volunteering in other demographics. So there's also, our research has found there's also data to suggest that there's patterns of volunteering skewed towards certain migrant cohorts and settlement outcomes. For example, humanitarian entrants or refugees and those living in the most socioeconomically disadvantaged areas of Victoria are least likely to be volunteers. And this may be because they find, or we're finding it harder to engage more disadvantaged CALD communities in volunteering. And this could be because, you know, they have a number of competing settlement challenges, especially for new arrivals, such as learning English, having access to transport, or, you know, suffering from experiences of trauma from their home country. Migrants are also likely to volunteer if they're unemployed. So this is something else we found in our research. So this suggests that, you know, many people do volunteer because they see it as a valuable pathway to employment, or a stepping stone where they can get that really valuable local experience before getting a paid job. So, you know, volunteering serves many purposes.
It absolutely does. And for those who are online, hopefully this does resonate with some of your personal experience in managing volunteers from a CALD background. Certainly in having discussions with Carissa, the notion of volunteering as a pathway to employment was so familiar to me based on some of the volunteer management roles I had, and speaking to volunteers from a CALD background who were looking particularly for local experience. So thinking, you know, to deconstruct this a little further, I wondered if I could ask you in particular, Reshma, how you involve volunteers at AIMS, particularly in the hub where you guys are, and what's the main feedback about how volunteers feel about their experience with you guys, particularly in AIMS, being, you know, highly aware of how you need to support volunteers from a CALD background effectively.
With Multicultural Hub, most of our volunteers now, the volunteers we recruit, are sort of word of mouth. So people who volunteered with us, and then they tell their friends, and so on, and then they sort of, you know, that's how we get our volunteers. And their feedback when you're in a new country, Sarah, and then you're building up new relationship, learning new language, learning new way of life, it can be very isolating, and it can be you can feel very lonely. That's my personal experience as well. You've left your family behind, you've left your friend behind, you've left a lot of things that you're familiar with behind, and learning new things. So for my volunteers at hub, multicultural hub then become, that small team becomes sort of like your friends, your first new friends that you've made in Australia. So it is a professional workplace, yes, but there are a lot of personal aspect of it as well, because you are learning about the new culture, you're learning about new ways of life. So for feedback from my volunteers I get from multicultural hubbies, we feel like this is our family. When we have our Christmas lunches, it's a family feeling. That's a feedback I get from my volunteers in a personal level. In a professional level, a lot of multicultural hub volunteers, they are there to gain paid employment. They're there to get that sort of local work experience. Most of them are very highly qualified individuals, and have you know uh, good work experiences from their native country, but lacking that local experience. And so multicultural hub provides that experience to them, build their confidence, sort of provide that local work experience knowledge, and provide referees, which is so important here in Australia. And many of our volunteers go to paid employment, and the gratitude and the the they're really happy. They're really happy, and they feel really good, working at hub, having that friend circle, being able to talk with people, gaining that professional experience. Yeah, it's overall, it's all good. I'm yet to experience something negative, a negative feedback or negative comment, or someone having a negative experience from volunteering at hub.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that's key is that you guys, obviously with the substance of the work that AIMS Australia does, are often pretty highly aware of some of the key challenges and barriers that can exist for people from CALD backgrounds to get into volunteering. And that's a good segue into my next question, which what are some of the key challenges and barriers that people from CALD backgrounds face, and how have these, what can you tell us about these? I'll go to you first, Carissa, and you can maybe give us what the statistics look like, and then Reshma, you can talk a little bit more about the experience you have with volunteers on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, well, I think definitely what you've listed here are the main ones. So English, knowing to where to actually look for volunteer work is quite challenging. Limited personal networks and local experience, which is very similar to having limited local work experience. But I think the main one, which I mentioned before, is sort of the concept of volunteering itself. Once people sort of get their head around that, I think that's a major challenge that's overcome. If they actually can see the benefits or understand the benefits of volunteering for their overall settlement, social engagement with the community, work experience, references. There's so many different benefits for new arrivals. So yeah, sort of getting over that initial hurdle of the having volunteering as a foreign concept, I think, is a really big one. In terms of the actual data around it, I don't have my my paper on hand actually, but what we'll do is we'll hopefully Sarah can share or link to our paper, and you can actually read the detail of the data around these challenges and barriers for yourself in your own time. And but yeah, very much the ones that I've just mentioned are the key ones.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to break down some of these key challenges and barriers and think about how they might play out in a one-to-one setting. So for example, things like confidence with English. that can be a real barrier when you're recruiting volunteers in a group setting. So people may feel less confident speaking up if they're in a group interview, or less confident asking questions about shifts or adjustments that might need to be made. One of the other really interesting facts, which I've popped down on the slide there, was what came out of our State of Volunteering report, which is that there is a financial barrier, and on average volunteers spend $1,700 per year on their volunteer involvement in a variety of ways. And that type of financial barrier, when you may be less secure financially or in less secure work, is a real challenge for people to overcome. Reshma, did you want to talk about some of the challenges and barriers?
Yes, like the first one, confidence with English is there, but sometimes not knowing, again, sort of not knowing what volunteering is as well. Like I said, we do volunteer in our culture. Like Carissa said, you take someone go and buy grocery for someone, or in Nepal mostly we work around temples and stupas, like you go there, cook and so on. And our whole like right now we have a catering services, but before it was like if it's someone's wedding, you invite 500 to 700 people guests, but all the cooking and everything will be done in a volunteer basis, where one person from each family will come and cook.
Wow.
So that's volunteering. But when we don't know, for people who've come to Australia, sometimes you don't realize that here in Australia you can go to an office setting and work as a volunteer, as a like office admin. That is a new concept. Working in a temple and stupas and doing this cooking and cleaning for someone is volunteering. That's what we do, but we don't go in an office setting to volunteer. So that is a new concept. So getting over that is a barrier. And not knowing where to look for volunteer work is a barrier. So though, and like you said, finance, someone who's come here new, haven't got work, and then don't have a lot of my volunteers whose sometimes husbands are working, but they're not working. So they feel like bad spending money on public transport, working as a volunteer when they're not making any money.
Absolutely. And so
They're not being paid, yes.
So thinking about ways in which, you can support volunteers for that not to be a barrier, in terms of potentially reimbursing or providing a meal for a volunteer shift, or reimbursing the cost of public transport. All of these things are different measures that might make or remove some of these key barriers that are faced by volunteers from the CALD community. So, sorry, go on, Reshma.
Yeah, I think, if organization can pay for the ticket, that'll be great.
Yeah, and not all organizations are necessarily in the financial position to do, but all of these types of things are really interesting to examine. Once we know what the barriers are, we can start to put forward some solutions that might reduce those in an impactful way. So moving on, because we can't go through any webinar now without mentioning COVID. I was wondering, did COVID-19 have an impact last year? What did you see in terms of volunteers at the hub, or volunteering in general across CALD communities? And I'll go back to you, Reshma.
We were like, we had a very devastating impact. Actually, we were running all our, like in multicultural hub, we've got 31 volunteers every week. All of that stopped, and then we've got all our English conversation classes run by our volunteers. 5 of our English conversation classes that stopped. We managed to run 2 online classes, but having said that, most of the face-to-face part of the work, like admin reception, we couldn't do because we all went working from home, and we weren't able to provide, sort of laptops and stuff needed to volunteers. And plus there wasn't much work for them because they are mainly customer service at the reception. And with online setting, some of the volunteers weren't comfortable running Zoom classes, for example. There was two English tutors who were happy to run Zoom classes, but most of the other tutors weren't ready for that. And pre-COVID, we didn't know Zoom. Now we are like very familiar with what Zoom is and so many things we can do. Even the students who were coming to these classes weren't familiar or ready to go digital. I think now, like a year later, we're in a much better position. But the barrier around digital literacy became huge for us at Hub.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to recognise that while it's great to have all these online options, we really were playing catch up from the start of last year, and it's not as easy for everyone to hop on board. Carissa, did you have anything you wanted to talk about what the kind of impact was in a larger sense?
Yeah, well, I think Reshma's hit the nail on the head with the digital divide that we've seen since COVID. And obviously this is not unique to volunteering. We obviously we've seen this across our society with many forms of education moving online during the pandemic, and many people not having that access or having accessibility issues. But broadly speaking, a lot of volunteering has moved online, as Reshma also suggested. And at AIMS, this has been really good for many of our volunteers because it's been a way of keeping them engaged. But yeah, as Reshma mentioned, not all forms of volunteering easily convert online. But for those who were, supporting students to learn English, for example, that was something that was able to, assuming everyone has the right device, that was something that could have been moved online more easily than someone who was in a reception volunteer role, for example. But yeah, the digital device access issue is a big one that is being, that we need to overcome, not just in volunteering, but more broadly speaking.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that while there is there has obviously been a huge impact for AIMS and also for members of the CALD community, the impact for volunteering in general has just been very huge of COVID-19 in generally. And there's some great research that's been published by Volunteering Australia that talks to the decline in volunteer numbers. And like all of us, and like I'm sure many of you who are online today, we're all still grappling with how we can regenerate volunteering across Australia.
Yeah, and I'll just add, sorry, it's not all doom and gloom. Like I guess this is also a new opportunity for emerging forms of volunteering that we perhaps haven't used before or haven't been familiar before to people. Different kinds of online based volunteering has been coming out, not just at AIMS, but in other organizations. So it's kind of an exciting time as well.
Absolutely. And I'd say an exciting time for actually us understanding more traditional informal types of volunteering. And we talked a little bit about how understandings of volunteering is maybe lends itself to the informal in CALD communities. One of the big things that we noticed during the pandemic was a rise in informal volunteering amongst the general community, people participating in kindness pandemics, people helping out their neighbours during lockdown. And I think there's great potential to see our definition of volunteering and understanding of volunteering change and adapt in a really positive way.
For sure.
So we've got just a few more questions. So if you want to ask a question of Carissa and Reshma, please feel free. Now's a good time to pop it in the chat. But I wanted to ask you both, how can we make recruitment practices, in particular for those who are thinking of, I guess, regenerating their volunteer programs and hoping to make them attractive to CALD members of the CALD community. What are things that you can suggest to people about improving their recruitment practices? And I'll throw to you, Reshma.
Like like a streamlined process for signing up as a volunteer. That is good. Sometimes people get overwhelmed when if the applying process is very complicated. That's your first barrier. If English is not your first language and you've got to go through hoops just to apply, you're going to give up. So if you can make your applying process simpler, that will help. And someone to talk with. I think I'll just give you I can just give my example. This like reading signs. How when we are walking down the street and we read signs, we say, okay, there's a sign for the toilets, there's a sign for the post office. That's a very Western thing. Sometimes that's not and we do it automatically here. That's how like we program. But sometimes that's not the case for someone who's come from a different background to say. So if you have a dedicated person, someone wants to become a volunteer and inquiring about becoming a volunteer, and there's a person like dedicated person to talk with, that will also help. And informal session for recruitment, like I think Sarah, you said, or Carissa said before, in a group setting, if somebody has to answer the in talk in English, and if it is a very formal setting, people might not open up and feel very nervous, and so on. So informal setting, I find it useful. And like if you make it a bit of a fun, and not as an interview, so as to say, it will be good. And then I think the most important one is to train staff in cultural competence, because we've all come from a different culture. We've all got different norms and different way of presenting, and some things we may do come across as a rude or culturally inappropriate, whereas in other cultures that's absolutely fine. So if we can be aware of each other's culture, that will be good. And encourage your volunteers as well. I mean, we talk about English being your second language. Like I always say this to my volunteers in Multicultural Hub. If you make mistake in English while you're speaking English, don't take it as a negative, take it as a positive, because that means you speak more than one language. English, if you're making mistake talking in English, you've got one more language. That just proves that you've got one more language. So that positive encouragement always helps.
Oh,
in my experience.
Absolutely. Carissa, did you have anything you wanted to talk to there?
Yeah, well, might help to just mention that at AIMS we're really fortunate to have a strong workforce and volunteering force that are from a CALD background. So we've got a lot of experience around engaging volunteers from CALD backgrounds, and we've worked with a lot of other organisations to share what's worked for us. So really, I think organisations really just need to apply a CALD lens to their volunteering practices, and there's sort of two main questions that they can ask themselves. Number one is, do you have flexible volunteering recruitment practices to engage volunteering? And for example, as Reshma said, having an informal sort of recruitment process rather than a formal interview might be one way to go about that. And the second question really that organisations can ask themselves, or their recruitment processes, is there culturally appropriate information to engage or sustain CALD volunteers in your organisation? So, language and cultural diversity, diverse products, for recruitment can help. Sometimes you might need to translate things into a different language, if that means that you're going to reach more people, for example.
Absolutely. That's really great. And we did just have, I guess, if you could both sum up into one main piece of advice for organisations, and then we've got a couple of questions that have come through, which is exciting. But if you wanted to share one favourite in terms of one favourite piece of advice for organisations, that would be wonderful. And I'll go back to you, Carissa.
One piece of advice. Well, something that works really well for us is, we've got really strong ties to CALD community leaders. And I think, with the most recent, what we've been going through with COVID and everything, and the difficulties around the government engaging CALD volunteers, that's just an example of the strength of CALD community leaders, because they really bridge that gap between community and government, or it could be community and your organisation. So if you can start to engage CALD community leaders, that is definitely going to go a long way, because these are the people that really know their community more than anybody. They know their needs, and they have a wide reach of people, and they can really explain to you what the challenges are, and help you to overcome them. And you can work with organisations like AIMS or other community based organisations to find these community leaders. And they shouldn't always work on a volunteer basis as well. They often just obviously well deserving to be paid for the work that they do, because they've got a really big task, but very important work.
Fantastic, thanks. Reshma, did you have anything you wanted to add, or one piece of advice that you wanted to highlight about how organisations can get started in involving?
If you're thinking about involving volunteers from a CALD background, train your staff. Cultural competency is very important, and it can be make or break. So, have a chat with your staff, find out where the gap is, and train your staff before you start recruiting.
Fantastic. And that leads us very well into the next question, which is someone has asked about whether there's any training in cultural competence that you would recommend. You might be recommending AIMS, or maybe there's some online training that you guys know of. Are you happy to
well, we definitely deliver that. I don't want to just sit here and spruik games, but we've just, for example, we've been working with the City of Hume to deliver such programs, cultural competency around volunteer engagement in CALD communities. So and we're constantly reviewing these materials and updating them, and really utilizing the impact of the feedback from those that we deliver these programs to, and also the CALD communities that we work with. So I think it's well worth investing in a program like this.
Fantastic. So certainly contacting AIMS is a great option. Reshma, was there any other training that you wanted to spruik or talk about, or otherwise we'll make sure that Reshma and Carissa's contact details are available with the policy worksheet if anyone wants to get in touch with them around training.
No, I think I'll just stick with Carissa's answer.
Fantastic. And so there's been one more question that's come through just around, I guess, the person was asking, how can we better communicate with prospective volunteers from CALD communities, both when trying to attract volunteers and also once they've come on board. So potentially that's just looking at what messages and also where you might better communicate with prospective volunteers from CALD communities, but certainly let me know if I've interpreted the question incorrectly. Reshma, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, so like Carissa also said, getting in touch with community leaders. I think that's the best way, because like she said, they have they have their ways of talking, and but once you engage the volunteers, that's where the my role comes in. It's with volunteers from or any volunteer in that matter in an organization, they need to be supported. So someone, if there's a dedicated role, like a volunteer coordinator, for example, in any organization who is there to support, to listen, to get a feedback, that will be the best way. Because once you have, let's say, once you've got volunteers from any CALD background or any volunteers, and they will support it, and they feel they're supported, and they're getting benefit out of that. Word of mouth, like Multicultural Hub, we hardly have to advertise to recruit our volunteers. We always have waiting lists, because that word of mouth, people talk, volunteers who've come to work with us, they talk and they tell their friends and they tell their other community members, and that's how we get our referrals. So once you've got volunteers working in your organization, they will support it, then you'll be fine. So I think the like Carissa said, chat with the community leaders, get in touch with them, find out what will work. Second is train the staff before you recruit volunteers in cultural competency, and then have person supporting the volunteers once you have them in there, and sort of encourage volunteers. If English is not their first language, that's not a biggie. We're a culture where we speak a lot of different languages, and we make mistakes. Making mistakes is fine. I think that is, we've got to emphasize on that. Like, we all make mistakes, and in English also, I'm sure I've made a lot of mistakes today talking about all
Not at
these
all.
issues, and it is fine, it is all right. And so I think those are the things organizations have to consider um, before they recruit and after they recruit volunteers from CALD background.
Fantastic. I think that's a really wonderful note to end things on. So there are no other questions that I've seen come through. So look, I'd just like to thank you both for your time. And obviously, the session today doesn't even begin to unpack all of the complexity in terms of CALD experience and the diversity in CALD communities, but hopefully it will give those online a really good way to start and good set them on the right path. So thank you all, and thank you particularly Carissa and Reshma, and hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See ya.
See ya.